Let me start with this. There are some men in this world who never ask for praise. They never post about their sacrifices. They never say, "Look what I gave up for you." They just keep showing up, quietly, daily, year after year. And because they are silent, people start thinking they are small. That was my father. Or maybe I should say, that was my older brother too, in a different way. In our family, there was always one person carrying the weight of everyone else's comfort. For years, he gave up his hobbies, his dreams, his peace, his own wants, just so the rest of us could breathe easier. If there was money needed, he handled it. If there was a problem, he fixed it. If someone needed help, he was the first one there. He never complained. He never said, "I'm tired." He never said, "What about me?" He just kept going. And the cruelest part? The family got used to it. They got so used to his sacrifice that they stopped seeing it as sacrifice at all. They started calling him simple, old-fashioned, too quiet, too easy to ignore. They thought his silence meant weakness. They were wrong. I still remember the night everything changed. It was my cousin's wedding. One of those big family events where everyone dresses up, acts important, and smiles too much in front of people they secretly don't like. The hall was decorated beautifully. Bright lights hung from the ceiling. White flowers were everywhere. Music floated through the air. People were laughing, taking pictures, pretending everything in the family was perfect. But behind all that glitter, there was tension. There always is in families like ours. My father came early, as he always did. He helped with chairs. He checked the food arrangements. He even fixed one of the table decorations that had fallen over. He had not been asked. He just did it. That was him, always serving, never announcing it. He wore a simple dark suit that had been in his closet for years. Not expensive, not flashy, but clean, neat, respectable. I saw him standing near the side of the hall for a moment, looking at the lights, watching the guests arrive. He had that quiet expression he always wore when he was trying to make sure everyone else was okay. I went to him and said softly, "Dad, are you all right?" He smiled at me, a small smile. "I'm fine, baby. Go enjoy yourself." That was his answer to everything. I wish I could say I knew what was coming next, but I didn't. Because humiliation rarely announces itself before it enters the room. It usually comes smiling. Dinner started. The family gathered at the long tables. Laughter got louder. Phones came out. People began comparing dresses, jobs, cars, vacations, and children, as if life was some kind of competition that never ended. And then my uncle, the loudest one in the room, stood up with a glass in his hand. He was the kind of man who always talked like he was giving a speech, even when nobody asked for one. He tapped his glass and said, "Before we continue, I just want to say something." Everyone turned. He looked straight at my father. "I think we should all thank the people who made this wedding possible," he said. "The ones with real money, real status, and real connections." A few people laughed. My father stayed quiet. My stomach tightened. My uncle smiled and kept going. "Of course, not everyone here contributed equally. Some people just show up, sit silently, and eat like they belong to the same level as the rest of us." The laughter got louder. I froze. Then he said the line that cut the room in half. "You know, some people spend their whole lives being useful, but still never become important." The hall went quiet for half a second. That kind of quiet is worse than shouting, because everyone hears it, and nobody moves. I looked at my father. He did not react. Not even a flicker of anger. He just lowered his eyes, took a slow sip of water, and placed the glass down with steady hands. My chest burned. My mother looked shocked. My aunt looked away. My cousins stared at their plates. No one defended him. No one. And my uncle, emboldened by the silence, laughed and said, "I mean no disrespect. I'm just saying, some people in this family have spent years depending on others. Maybe it's time they admit where they stand." People laughed again. Uncomfortable this time, but they still laughed. My father took a breath. Then, very calmly, He stood up. The room stopped. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He did not point fingers. He did not beg for respect. He simply said, "You're right. Tonight is a good night to be honest." That surprised everyone. Afame. He looked around the room and continued. "For many years, I have kept this family standing in ways most of you never saw. I paid bills when nobody else could. I helped raise children when others were busy protecting their pride. I covered emergencies, fixed mistakes, and gave up my own plans so this family could keep moving. No drama, no anger, just truth." He turned slightly toward my uncle and said, "I never asked for applause, but I also never asked to be insulted in public." Now the room was silent in a different way, a heavy silence, the kind that makes people suddenly realize they have gone too far. "But my father was not finished," he said. "A man can survive being overlooked. What he cannot respect is being used and then mocked for it." His voice was calm. That was what made it so powerful. No shaking, no tears, no shouting, just a quiet dignity that made every word land like a stone. Then he did something nobody expected. He reached into his pocket, took out a folded paper, and handed it to the wedding organizer. "Please read this after dinner," he said. People looked confused. My uncle frowned. "What is that?" My father answered, "Something you should have known before tonight." Then he sat back down like nothing had happened. I wanted to ask him what that paper was. I wanted to know why he looked so calm. But I could feel that whatever it was going to change the whole room. And it did. After dinner, the organizer stepped to the microphone and said she needed to make an important announcement. She opened the paper. Then her face changed. She looked up, then back down, then up again. Everyone started whispering. She said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that the majority of the wedding hall, catering deposits, floral arrangements, photography, and a live music contract were all covered by one person." The room went still. She paused, then said, "Mr. Daniel Carter, my father." You could have heard a pin drop. The woman continued, clearly surprised herself. "Without Mr. Carter's help, this event would not have been possible. He paid for what had to be paid. He arranged what had to be arranged, and he did it quietly, without asking for credit." I looked around. Faces were changing all over the room. The same people who had laughed a few minutes earlier now looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under them. My uncle's expression fell apart first. Then my aunt. Then the cousins. One by one, the smiles disappeared. The organizer went on. "There is also one more item included in the note." She opened the second page. Her voice became slower. "Mr. Carter has informed us that as of tonight, he will no longer be covering any family expenses, emergency payments, or private requests made without clear agreement and respect." People began murmuring. She looked up again and said, "He asked that this message be shared publicly, so there is no misunderstanding." That was the moment. That exact moment, the room finally understood. My father had not been weak. He had been carrying them. And the thing about people who are always carrying everyone else is this. When they finally set the weight down, everybody notices how much was missing. My uncle stood up fast. "Wait, what does that mean?" My father looked at him without emotion and said, "It means exactly what it sounds like." My uncle tried to laugh, but it came out thin and ugly. "You didn't have to make it public." My father replied, "Neither did you." That line hit hard, because everyone knew what he meant. My uncle had publicly humiliated him, so my father had answered publicly too, but he did it without cruelty. That's what made it unforgettable. He was not trying to destroy anybody. He was simply refusing to be invisible. And then he did the thing I will never forget for the rest of my life. He stood up, took his jacket from the chair, and looked around the room one last time. Then he said, "I spent many years trying to make this family comfortable. Tonight I learned a painful truth. Comfort can make people careless. So from now on, I'll spend my energy where it is respected." He turned to leave. My heart started pounding. People rushed to speak at once. "Wait, Daniel. Come on, man, it was just a joke. You know we didn't mean it like that." But he did not stop. And I swear, in that moment, He looked taller than anyone else in the room. Not because of his body, because of his boundary. I stood up too and followed him out. The night air outside felt cold after the warm, crowded hall. I caught up to him near the parking area and said, "Dad." He turned to me. I was trying not to cry. "Why didn't you tell me all of this before?" He looked tired for the first time that night, but not broken, just honest. He said, "Because I didn't want you to see bitterness in me. I wanted you to see strength." That line broke something in me. I said, "They treated you horribly." He nodded. "Yes. Then why did you stay so long?" He looked up at the sky for a second before answering. "Because I love this family," he said. "And people often mistake love for permission." I never forgot those words. People often mistake love for permission. That sentence stayed with me like a scar. We stood there in silence for a while. Then he said something else I still think about whenever life gets hard. "I am not angry that they needed me. I am disappointed that they forgot I was a person too." That was my father. That was the real man behind the silence. Not weak, not foolish, just exhausted from giving to people who started believing he would never stop. Back inside the hall, the mood had completely changed. You could see it on everyone's faces. The wedding was still happening, but something deeper had happened too. The family had seen their own reflection, and they did not like it. Later that night, people began coming up to my father, one by one. Not because they suddenly became kind. No, because they suddenly became afraid. Afraid of losing access. Afraid of losing support. Afraid of losing the man they had taken for granted for years. That's the ugly truth about many families. They don't appreciate the giver until the giver starts walking away. My aunt pulled him aside and said in a low voice, "You could have handled that privately," my father answered. "I did. For years." My uncle tried a different approach. "You embarrassed the family." My father looked at him and said, "No, you embarrassed yourself." That was the end of the argument. And honestly, it was the beginning of his peace. The next few weeks were different, very different. At first, people thought he would come back around. They assumed he would soften. They assumed he would keep doing what he had always done, because that is what silent people are expected to do. But this time, he didn't. He stopped taking random calls asking for money. He stopped solving problems no one thanked him for. He stopped being the invisible safety net everybody leaned on and nobody respected. And at first, the family acted offended. They said he was being cold. They said he had changed. They said he was acting proud. But my father was not acting proud. He was acting free. There is a difference. Free people do not beg to be useful. Free people choose where they give. And when they realized he was serious, the family started doing what families like that always do. They tried to guilt him. My uncle called him selfish. My aunt said he was tearing the family apart. One cousin said, "You used to be so good to everyone." My father answered, "I still am. But I am done being good to people who only remember me when they need something." That was the sentence that changed everything. Because once he said it out loud, nobody could pretend not to understand him anymore. A month later, my cousin's husband lost a major business contract. The kind of thing that could have ruined them financially. And guess who they came running to? My father. Of course, the same man they had mocked at the wedding. The same man they had laughed at. The same man they had treated like background furniture. My aunt called him, suddenly sweet as honey. "Daniel, we're all family. We know you can help us." My father listened quietly. Then he asked, "Did you know I was family when your husband laughed at me in front of 300 people?" She was silent. He continued, "Did you know I was family when your brother used me as a joke for entertainment?" No answer. Then he said something I will never forget. "Family is not what you call someone when you need them. Family is how you treat them when you think they have nothing left to offer." And then he hung up. No yelling, no revenge speech, just a clean, final boundary. I looked at him after that and realized something. The people who had once believed he needed them had been living in a lie. They thought he was dependent on their approval, but in truth, they had been dependent on his generosity. And when that truth became clear, his worth no longer had to be defended. It was visible, not because the family suddenly became wise, But because he became unavailable, that's when people start to notice. Not when you are always there, but when you are gone. Months passed. My father started living differently. He went back to the things he had abandoned for years. He started painting again, something he had loved before life turned him into a provider and a problem solver. He joined a weekend fishing group. He began reading at night instead of handling endless family calls. He took care of himself in ways I had never seen before. He looked healthier, lighter, calmer, and honestly, happier. The strange thing was, the family only began to respect him after they saw that he no longer needed their approval. People who had ignored him before now spoke to him with careful voices. People who had laughed at him now praised his wisdom. People who used to call him quiet now said he was deep. It was almost funny, but also sad. Because respect should never have to wait for departure. And he knew that. He always knew that. One evening, I sat with him on the porch while the sun was going down. I asked, "Do you regret how you handled that night?" He smiled a little. "No." "Do you miss how things used to be?" He thought about it. Then he said, "I miss the idea of the family I thought I had." That answer stayed with me, because that is grief too. Not just losing people, losing the version of them you believed in. I asked him, "Are you okay now?" He looked at me and said, "I am better than okay. I am honest now." I loved that answer, because sometimes honesty is the first real peace a person gets after years of being everyone else's shield. Then he said, "Never let anyone teach you that being kind means allowing disrespect." I nodded. He continued, "And never let people shame you for walking away from places that only value you when you are useful." That was the real lesson. Not revenge, not bitterness, just self-respect. A year later, at another family gathering, the difference was obvious. People were quieter around him, kinder, in a careful sort of way. The older generation tried to act like the past never happened. The younger ones understood it had. My uncle, the same man who had made the cruel speech, could barely look my father in the eye. And my father? He was polite, calm, distant enough to be protected, but not rude enough to become the villain they wanted him to be. That was the most powerful part. He did not become cruel just because others had been cruel to him. He remained dignified, and dignity is a language arrogant people understand only after they lose access to it. That night, someone asked him to give a toast. The room waited. My father stood, held the glass, and said just a few words. He said, "I wish this family peace, honesty, and mutual respect. And I hope we all remember that love without gratitude becomes a burden." Then he raised his glass and sat down. No drama, no lecture, just truth again. And the room was quiet. Not because anyone was offended this time, but because everyone felt it, even the ones who had never apologized, especially them. That's how the story ended. Or maybe that's how it began. Because after that night, my father was never the same man to them again. He was no longer the easy answer, no longer the silent backup plan, no longer the person they could ignore in daylight and depend on in crisis. He had become something else. A man with boundaries, a man with self-worth, a man who knew exactly how much he had given and exactly how much he would no longer accept in return. And yes, the family later realized his importance. They realized it in the awkward silence after he left the wedding hall. They realized it when his support disappeared. They realized it when the comforts they once treated as normal were gone. But by then, it was too late to get the old version of him back. Because respect, once broken, does not always return in the same form. And access, once lost, is not always restored. That's what they did not understand. He was not angry forever. He was just done being available to people who only valued him when it was convenient. And maybe that is the strongest thing a person can do. Not scream, not fight, not beg. Just step back and let people live without the version of you they took for granted. Because when a good man finally stops carrying everyone else, the world learns very quickly how heavy he was. And that night, my father stopped being the family's shadow. He became their mirror, and they did not like what they saw. But I did. But there was one thing I never told anyone. After that wedding night, after all the whispers, After all the apologies that came too late, I thought my father would finally feel victorious. He did not. He felt relieved. There is a difference. Victory is loud. Relief is quiet. And my father had lived too many years in silence to suddenly become a man who needed applause. In the days after the wedding, I watched him closely. He was still calm, still polite, still kind. But something had changed in him. He no longer carried the invisible tension he used to carry everywhere. It was as if a heavy chain had finally slipped off his chest. Before that night, he used to answer every call immediately. He used to drop everything if a family member needed something. He used to apologize even when he had done nothing wrong. Now he paused first. Now he thought first. Now he asked questions before giving help. And that small change made the whole family uncomfortable. Because for the first time, they had to deal with a version of him that was no longer desperate to please them. That made them nervous. My aunt called again a few days later, this time pretending to be warm. "We all just want things to go back to normal." My father answered, "Normal was the problem." She went quiet. Then she said, "You know everyone was emotional that night." He replied, "No, they were honest. That was the problem." And then he ended the call. That was another thing I noticed. He had stopped explaining himself. He had stopped trying to make them understand the pain they had caused. Because some people only listen when they are afraid of losing you. And once they are afraid, they are not really listening to your hurt. They are listening to their own loss. One afternoon, I found him in his room, looking through an old box. Inside were things I had not seen in years. Old sketchbooks, a camera, a fishing hat, a set of paintbrushes. I looked at him and said, "I didn't know you kept all this." He gave a small smile. "I almost forgot I used to be a person before I became everyone's helper." That sentence stayed with me longer than I can explain, because that is what sacrifice can do. It can turn a human being into a function, a wallet, a driver, a fixer, a quiet solution. And people stop seeing the heart behind the help. I sat down beside him and picked up one of the sketchbooks. There were drawings inside. Not perfect drawings, not professional, but beautiful in their own way. Trees, water, small houses, mountains, a face here and there, scenes from places he had once wanted to visit. He noticed me looking and said, "I used to draw when I was younger. Why did you stop?" He leaned back in his chair and said, "Because life got louder than me." I felt tears rise in my throat. Life got louder than me. That was exactly what had happened. His dreams had not died because they were weak. They had died because he had kept putting them behind everyone else's needs. And now, after all those years, he was picking them up again, one by one, like broken pieces of himself that still deserved to be loved. I asked, "Are you going to paint again?" He looked at the brushes in his hand, then at me, and said, "I already started." He pointed to a canvas in the corner. It was half finished. A quiet lake under a pale evening sky. Simple, peaceful, beautiful. I remember staring at it for a long time. It looked nothing like the old version of him the family had mocked. It looked like healing, and maybe that is what shocked me the most. He had not just survived humiliation. He had used it to return to himself. Weeks passed, then months. The family slowly changed their tone. Not because they became better people all at once, but because his absence had taught them something they had refused to learn through love. The house felt different when he was not around to solve every problem. Events felt different when he did not quietly cover the cost. Conversations felt different when he was no longer the easy target. That kind of silence changes people, and the most interesting part? They started missing not just his money or help. They started missing his presence. Because a man like that does more than give support. He gives stability. He gives calm. He gives the strange feeling that things will be okay, no matter how bad they look. And when someone like that steps back, everybody feels the cold. At one point, my younger cousin admitted something to me. She said, "We thought Uncle Daniel would always be there." I looked at her and asked, "And now?" She lowered her head. "Now it feels like we took him for granted." It was the first honest thing I had heard from that side of the family in a long time. I nodded. But I did not comfort her, because truth doesn't need to be softened every time. Sometimes it needs to stand exactly as it is. Then came the next major family event. My grandfather's birthday. Another big gathering. Another decorated hall. Another room full of people pretending they had learned from the last disaster. This time, nobody made jokes at my father's expense. This time, everybody spoke carefully. This time, the atmosphere was polite in that stiff, nervous way people get when they know they have lost the moral ground but do not know how to reclaim it. My uncle even tried to be nice. Too nice. The kind of nice that feels like fear wearing a suit. He walked up to my father and said, "Daniel, good to see you." My father shook his hand and said, "Good to be respected." That was it. Just 6 words, but they carried more weight than 1,000 speeches. My uncle nodded slowly, like he had been hit by something invisible. Later that evening, during the family dinner, my grandfather stood up and asked everyone to listen. He was an old man, not dramatic, not flashy, but he knew exactly what had happened that night months ago. He looked at the room, then at my father, and said, "I have lived long enough to know that the quiet ones are often the ones holding everything together." Nobody moved. He continued, "A family that humiliates the one who supports it is a family that has lost its wisdom." The room went very still. Then he turned to my father and said, "You did not deserve what happened to you, and I am sorry." That apology mattered, not because it fixed everything. It didn't. But because it came from someone who understood the weight of dignity. My father bowed his head slightly and said, "Thank you." Nothing more. No speech. No emotional performance. Just respect. Meeting respect. And that was powerful enough to change the whole mood of the room. After dinner, some relatives came over with careful smiles, trying to rebuild what they had broken. Some asked about his painting. Some asked about his fishing. Some asked about his work. They were trying. But my father was no longer the same man who would open his whole heart just because people finally asked. He answered kindly, but briefly. He had learned that not every hand reaching toward you is reaching with love. Some are reaching because they miss control, and some are reaching because they miss convenience. I think that was the final lesson for everyone. He was still kind. He was still generous. But now, his kindness had boundaries. His generosity had rules. His love had dignity, and that changed everything. Because people can live without your money. People can live without your help. People can even live without your constant presence. But they struggle to live without your strength once they have depended on it for too long. My father had been the unseen foundation of this family. And once the foundation started moving, the walls began to crack. The truth had always been there. They had just refused to see it. One evening, a few weeks later, I found him outside again, sitting under the porch light with a cup of tea. The sky was dark. The air was soft. The house was quiet. I sat beside him and said, "Do you think they really understand now?" He watched the street for a few seconds before answering. "Some of them do," he said. "Some of them only understand that I am harder to reach now." I laughed quietly because it was true. He smiled a little too, then became serious again. "But that is still progress," he said. I rested my head back and looked at the stars. Then I asked, "What do you want now?" He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I want a life that does not require me to disappear in order to keep everyone else comfortable." I turned to look at him. That was the first time I had ever heard him say something that sounded like a dream for himself. Not for the family, not for work, not for duty, for himself. And I realized then that the real ending of the story was not the humiliation. It was not the wedding. It was not the apology. It was this. A man who had spent years being treated like a tool finally deciding to live like a person again. That is why this story matters. Because so many people do this. They give and give and give until there is almost nothing left of them. And while they are doing it, everyone around them starts calling their sacrifice normal. But it is not normal. It is not normal to ignore a man's pain because he is strong. It is not normal to laugh at the person who keeps your world stable. It is not normal to only respect someone when they stop being available. And it is definitely not normal to act surprised when the quiet one finally walks away. My father did not become cruel. He became clear. He did not become selfish. He became selective. He did not stop loving the family. He just stopped letting love be used against him. And honestly, that is one of the most powerful things a person can do. Because once someone chooses peace over approval, the entire room has to reintroduce itself. That is what happened here. The family later realized his importance. But by then, he was no longer accessible in the same way. Not because he hated them, but because he had finally learned that being needed is not the same as being valued. And I think that lesson changed all of us, especially me, because I watched a man get humiliated in public and refuse to collapse. I watched him answer disrespect with dignity. I watched him lose the comfort of being taken for granted, and I watched him build a new life out of the pieces they thought they had crushed. That night at the wedding, the family believed they were exposing his place, but they were really exposing their own blindness. And when the truth finally came out, it did not make him smaller. It made him unforgettable, because there is a kind of strength that doesn't shout. It doesn't slam doors. It doesn't beg for attention. It simply stands there, calm and unbroken, until everyone else is forced to see it. That was my father. And that is why, even now, when people ask me about the most powerful moment in my family's history, I do not mention the wedding cake, the flowers, or the music. I mention the silence. The silence after he stood up. The silence after they learned the truth. The silence after they realized the man they mocked was the one who had been carrying them all along. That silence changed everything, because in that silence, he stopped being invisible. But even after all that, there was still one final moment I will never forget. Because healing does not always arrive in a straight line. Sometimes it comes back one last time to test whether you really learned the lesson. It happened on a rainy evening. About 2 months after the grandfather's birthday, the family had gathered again. This time for something smaller, less formal, but still important. A house blessing. Just close relatives. Just a few chairs, warm food, low music, and that strange family politeness that always appears after a scandal when nobody wants to talk about what everyone remembers. My father came late, not because he was trying to make a statement, because for once, he was living like his time mattered. He had spent the afternoon at the riverside with his sketchbook and a thermos of tea. He told me later that he had been painting clouds and old boats, the kind of things he used to love before duty swallowed him whole. When he walked into the room, people noticed immediately. Not because he was loud, because he was no longer easy to ignore. That is what changes when a person stops shrinking. My aunt stood up first and offered him a seat near the front. My uncle, awkward as ever, cleared his throat and tried to act normal. My cousins watched him with the careful eyes of people who had once laughed too freely and now did not know where to put their guilt. Everyone was behaving, too carefully, too quietly. Then, in the middle of dinner, one of my younger cousins, a boy who had always copied the tone of the older adults, made a joke. Not a cruel joke this time, a careless one. He pointed at my father's plain shirt and said, half laughing, "Uncle still dresses like he's saving money for the whole family." A few people chuckled nervously. It was not a brutal insult, but it was familiar. Too familiar. I felt the room tense. My father put down his fork, wiped his mouth, and looked at the boy with a calm expression. Then he smiled. Not a fake smile, a real one. And he said, "I used to." The boy blinked. My father continued, "I used to save money for everyone. I used to save time, energy, peace, and even my own dreams. But I don't dress for that life anymore." The room became still. He looked around the table and said, "I dress now for the man I am becoming." That sentence landed softly, but it hit hard, because everyone there knew exactly what he meant. He was no longer the man who survived by disappearing. He was becoming someone who lived on purpose. Then he said something even more powerful. "I am not angry at the past," he said, "but I am no longer available to repeat it." Nobody spoke, not even the child. The rain tapped gently against the windows, and in that quiet room, I saw the whole family understand it at last. Respect was not going to be earned through guilt anymore. It had to be shown consistently, truthfully, without performance. After dinner, my uncle came to sit beside my father on the porch. I thought he was coming to apologize again, but it was different this time. He was not trying to manage the situation. He looked older than usual, smaller somehow. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he finally spoke. "Daniel," he said, "I wanted to tell you something." My father turned slightly. "Go ahead." My uncle swallowed hard. "You were never just helping the family. You were holding it together." My father did not react. He just listened. My uncle kept going, his voice rough now. "I think we got comfortable. Too comfortable. We thought because you were quiet, you didn't feel. We thought because you didn't fight back, it meant you didn't mind." He looked at the ground. "That was stupid." My father remained still. My uncle nodded, as if admitting the truth was painful but necessary. "I know I can't undo what I said at the wedding." "No," my father said gently. "You can't." That answer was not cruel. It was honest. And honesty can be kinder than false forgiveness. My uncle looked up at him. "So what happens now?" My father leaned back in the chair and looked at the wet street outside. "Now," he said, "you live with it. And maybe, if you are wise, you learn from it." That was it. No revenge, no grand speech, just consequences, real consequences, the kind that do not need noise to be felt. My uncle nodded slowly, and for the first time in his life, I think he understood that respect is not something you can demand after you have already destroyed it. You have to protect it before it dies. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat with my father in the kitchen while he drank warm milk and looked through his old drawings. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Do you know what I learned from all this?" I shook my head. He tapped one of the sketchbook pages and answered, "That peace is not found by making everyone happy. It is found by refusing to betray yourself just to keep the room calm." I stared at him, because that was the cleanest truth I had ever heard. He went on, "For years, I thought being a good man meant tolerating too much. Now I know better. Being a good man also means knowing when to step back." I asked, "Do you think they've changed for real?" He smiled, but not entirely. "Some have," he said. "Some are only behaving because they're afraid of losing me again. That still counts for something, but it is not the same as understanding." I nodded. That was fair. And maybe that was the deepest lesson of the whole story. Not everyone who apologizes has truly changed. Not everyone who says sorry understands the damage. But even when people change only halfway, your boundaries can still protect you. That is enough. It has to be enough. Because a person cannot build a life forever around other people's unfinished growth. The months after that became the quietest and best months I had seen in our house. My father spent more time outdoors, more time painting, more time resting without guilt. He even started teaching me how to sketch the way he used to. He would show me how to look at shadows, how to notice the shape of light, how to stop forcing perfection into something that was meant to be alive. While he taught me, I kept thinking that maybe this was what he had been trying to give us all along. Not just support, not just money, not just stability, but a way of seeing the world with more patience and more grace. The family slowly adjusted to his new life. At first, they acted like they were waiting for the old him to return. But he didn't. He was still warm, still helpful, still caring, just no longer automatic. And that was the point. He had stopped being a machine that responded to every request. He had become a man, a full man, with a life, with limits, with a right to say no. And when the family finally accepted that, their behavior changed too. Not enough to erase the past, but enough to prove the lesson had stuck. They invited him differently. They spoke to him differently. They listened more. And when they needed help, they asked with respect instead of assumption. It was a small change. But in families like ours, small changes are actually enormous. One afternoon, long after the drama had settled, I found my father standing beside the lake, sketchbook in hand. The sun was low. The water was smooth. The sky looked like it had been painted by someone who understood silence. I walked up beside him and asked, Do you think people will remember this story? He glanced at me and smiled. Not the way we do, he said. Then why did it matter? He looked out at the water for a moment. Then he answered, because sometimes a family has to be shaken awake before it learns how to love properly. I let that sit in the air between us. Then I asked one last question. Are you happier now? He thought about it. Then he said, I am not living for permission anymore. That's close enough to happiness for me. And I remember standing there, listening to that answer, realizing something I wish every person carrying silent pain could understand. You do not have to break publicly for your pain to be real. You do not have to beg to be seen. You do not have to stay where you are only valued after you are exhausted. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is quietly remove yourself from the place that keeps teaching people to underestimate you. That is what my father did, and once he did it, he never needed to prove his worth again, because the truth was already there. He had always been worthy. They were just late, far too late. So yes, the family later realized his importance. They realized it when his help was gone. They realized it when the silence he left behind became louder than his presence had ever been. They realized it when the house no longer felt the same without the man they used to take for granted. But by then, he had already crossed into a different kind of life. A calmer one, a freer one, a more honest one. And from that point on, he was no longer the person they could call just because they were used to him answering. He had become something they could not manipulate anymore. And still, even after all that, life had one more quiet way of proving the lesson. It happened many months later, when the family had almost convinced themselves that the past was far behind us. Almost. Because families do that sometimes. They bury pain under routine. They cover guilt with holiday meals. They wrap old wounds in polite conversation and call it healing. But the truth does not disappear just because people stop mentioning it. My father knew that. So did I. By then, he had built a life that looked very different from the one he had before. His mornings were slow and peaceful. He woke up early, made tea, and spent time on the porch with his sketchbook. On weekends, he would drive to quiet places by the water and paint landscapes no one had asked him to paint. He read books he enjoyed. He laughed more often. He slept better. He was not becoming a different person. He was becoming the person he had always been before duty buried him. That was the most beautiful part. Not that he became stronger. He had always been strong. But that now, for the first time in years, his strength was being used for his own life too. One afternoon I asked him, do you ever feel guilty for stepping back from everyone? He looked at me carefully, like he wanted to answer in a way that would stay with me. Then he said, no, I feel sad that it had to come to that. That was so like him. Even after everything, he was still kinder than the people who had hurt him. He continued, if people only appreciate you after you become unavailable, then they were never learning to love you properly in the first place. I said nothing, because there was nothing left to add. That truth was complete on its own. Not long after that, the family faced a real crisis. Not a dramatic fight, not a public embarrassment. Something quieter, and maybe more revealing. There was a major issue with the old family property. Documents were missing. Arguments broke out. People began blaming one another. Suddenly, the same relatives who had once looked down on my father were panicking, calling him, asking him to help sort everything out. And for a moment, I thought he might refuse immediately. But he didn't. He listened. He asked questions. He said he would look at the papers, not because he was weak, not because he had changed back, but because he had finally learned the difference between helping and being used. He sat at the kitchen table for hours, reading through old records, making notes, cross-checking dates, and speaking with a quiet confidence that made me realize how much intelligence had always been in him, hidden under years of being overlooked. My mother watched him and whispered to me, I wish they had respected him before this. I nodded. So do I said. By evening, he had found the problem. It turned out that a small but important section of the property documents had been handled carelessly years ago, and that carelessness had nearly created a legal mess for everyone. My father fixed it before it became worse, not with anger, not with revenge, just with patience and competence. When he explained the solution to the family, nobody spoke for a while, because this time, they were not seeing him as the quiet man in the corner. They were seeing the man whose calm mind had saved them from a much bigger disaster. And one by one, the same people who had once mocked him began to realize something painful. He had always been this capable. They had simply been too proud to notice. My uncle, who had once made the cruelest jokes, stood there with a face full of regret. He finally said, "You should have been the first person we trusted." My father looked at him and answered, "Trust is easier to ask for after you have already lost it." There was no anger in his voice, only truth. That made it harder to ignore. A few relatives tried to change the subject. Some started praising his work. Some acted like this was all just a misunderstanding from the past. But those attempts felt thin now. Everyone in the room understood that the damage had been real, and more importantly, everyone understood that my father no longer needed their approval to survive. That was the deepest shift of all. He was still helping, but he was helping from a place of choice, not obligation. He was still kind, but his kindness now came with a spine. He was still family, but he was no longer the family's hidden sacrifice. After that evening, there was a strange new honesty in the house. People spoke more carefully. They asked before assuming. They thanked him more often. They stopped expecting immediate answers. And while that did not erase the past, it showed that some part of the lesson had finally landed. One night, much later, I heard my younger cousin say to another relative, "Uncle Daniel is different now." The reply came softly, "No, he's the same. We just see him better now." I stood in the hallway when I heard that, and I had to close my eyes for a second, because that was exactly it. He had not changed into someone else. He had simply become impossible to overlook. That is what happens when a person finally stops apologizing for existing. The world has to adjust. The house also changed in smaller ways. The old phone calls from people asking for favors became fewer. The sudden emergencies that used to always land on his shoulders became someone else's problem for once. And the silence that filled those spaces did not feel empty. It felt clean. My father spent more time outside. He taught me how to mix colors properly in watercolor. He even laughed at my first terrible attempt and said, "Good. Now you know how not to do it." I smiled. It felt good to laugh with him like that. Not because the pain had vanished, but because it no longer controlled the room. And that, I think, is what real healing looks like. Not pretending nothing happened, not forcing peace, but building a life where your old wound no longer gets to be the only story. One evening, near sunset, he and I sat together by the lake again. The water was still. The sky was turning gold. He looked at the reflection for a long time and said, "I used to think I had to keep giving until someone finally saw how tired I was." I turned to him. He kept looking at the water. "Now I know," he said, "that if people need you to break before they value you, they were never standing with you in the first place." That sentence sat between us like a final seal. It was not bitter. It was not sad. It was simply true. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this whole story was never really about one humiliating night. It was about the long, quiet years before it. The years of sacrifice no one thanked him for. The years of being depended on but not defended. The years of giving so much that his own life became invisible to the people closest to him. That wedding only revealed what had already been there. The disrespect, the entitlement, the blindness. But it also revealed something else. His strength, his patience, his refusal to collapse for the comfort of people who did not deserve his collapse. That was the moment everything turned. Not because he shouted, not because he fought, because he stood still and let the truth speak for itself. And the truth was louder than all of them. Now, when I think back on it, I remember the family's faces after they realized what they had lost. I remember the silence. I remember the way respect returned, but too late to restore what was broken. I remember how they slowly had to learn that a man who has been undervalued for too long will eventually stop being available for that kind of pain. And I remember my father most of all, not as the man they mocked, not as the man they depended on, but as the man who finally chose himself without becoming cruel. That is the part that matters, because anyone can walk away angry. Anyone can slam a door and call it justice, but it takes a stronger kind of man to leave with dignity, to protect his peace without destroying everyone else, to say, no more, and mean it without bitterness. And once that happened, nothing ever went back to the old way again. Not really. Not in their hearts. Not in mine. Because now I know what strength looks like when it doesn't need to show off. I know what dignity looks like when it refuses to be embarrassed into silence. I know what a person looks like when they finally stop living as an answer to other people's needs and begin living as a person with needs of their own, and that changes how you see everything. And even after all of that, one final lesson was still waiting for me. It came quietly, not in a wedding hall, not in front of a crowd, but in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, when nobody expected anything life-changing to happen. My father was in the backyard, fixing the small wooden chair he used every morning. The same chair he sat on while drinking tea. The same chair he had repaired twice before instead of buying a new one. He believed in fixing things that still had life left in them. I watched him from the kitchen window for a while. He was not rushing. He was not complaining. He was simply working with the same calm hands that had once held up a whole family. Then he stopped, looked toward the house, and called me outside. I walked over and asked, "What happened?" He held the chair up slightly and said, "One of the legs was loose." I smiled. "You could have asked someone else to do it." He looked at me with that quiet expression he always had when he was about to say something important. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to do this myself." That caught me off guard, because for most of my life, I had seen him do things for everybody else. Fix things, pay things, carry things. So hearing him say he wanted to do something for himself felt strangely emotional. I sat on the porch step and asked, "Do you still think about that night?" He didn't answer right away. He set the chair down, wiped his hands on a cloth, and sat across from me. Then he said, "Yes, but not with anger anymore." I waited. He continued, "I think about it because that night ended one version of my life. The version where I was always available, always silent, always hoping kindness would eventually teach people how to treat me." He looked down at his hands. That version is gone. There was something almost peaceful in the way he said it. Not sad, not dramatic, just final. I asked, "Do you miss who you used to be?" He gave a small laugh, but it wasn't bitter. "No," he said. "I miss how innocent I was about people's intentions." That answer stayed with me, because that was the truth no one likes to say out loud. Sometimes the deepest pain does not come from strangers. It comes from the people who got too comfortable with your goodness. The people who thought your love was endless. The people who mistook patience for weakness. My father leaned back in the chair and looked at the sky. "I spent so long trying to keep everyone comfortable," he said, "that I forgot discomfort can be useful. It teaches people what they have been ignoring." I nodded, because yes, that was exactly what his boundary had done. It made everyone uncomfortable. But that discomfort became the first real lesson they had ever learned. Later that week, something happened that proved he had changed forever. One of my relatives called again asking for help. Not a small favor, a big one. The same kind of favor that once would have sent my father rushing into action without thinking. This time, he listened carefully. He asked what had happened. He asked what had already been done. He asked who else had been contacted. And then he said, very calmly, "I'm not able to take this on." There was silence on the other end. Then the relative tried again. But you always help, my father replied. That is exactly why I need to be careful now. The voice on the phone changed. First confusion, then irritation, then guilt. You're really not going to help family? My father did not raise his voice. He said, I am helping myself by not returning to a place where respect is optional. And then he ended the call. I stood there in the hallway after he hung up, staring at him like I was seeing him for the first time. He noticed and said, What? I shook my head. Nothing. I just didn't know you could do that so calmly. He smiled. I had to learn, he said. If you keep rescuing people from consequences, they never learn how to stand. That was another lesson. A hard one, but a true one. Because sometimes, love is not about saving everyone from every fall. Sometimes love is about refusing to keep enabling the same disrespect. Over time, the family began to understand something important. He had not withdrawn because he stopped caring. He had withdrawn because he started caring about himself too. That difference mattered a lot. His absence changed the family in subtle ways. Conversations became less careless. Requests became more polite. People stopped assuming he would agree before they even asked. And the strange part was this. When the pressure lifted, the relationships got more honest. Not perfect, but honest. That was better than before. One evening, my mother told me, Your father looks lighter now. She said it while watching him in the yard, where he was painting a small landscape on a cheap canvas he had bought for himself. And she was right. He did look lighter, not because life had become easy, but because he no longer carried what was never his to carry. I walked outside and sat beside him in silence. For a while, we just listened to the insects and the wind moving through the trees. Then I asked, What do you want people to remember about you? He kept painting and answered without looking up. That I loved them, he said. I waited for more, he added. But I also loved myself enough to stop being destroyed by them. That was it. Simple, powerful, complete. I think that was the moment I finally understood the full meaning of his story. It was never just about humiliation. It was never just about respect. It was about identity. About a man who gave so much of himself to a family that he nearly disappeared inside their needs. And then, at the exact moment they tried to make him small in public, he chose to become whole in private. That decision changed everything, not in one loud instant, but over time, quietly, steadily, the way real change often happens. Now, when I look back, I do not remember the family as villains in a simple way. Life is rarely that clean. I remember them as people who got used to comfort and forgot gratitude. I remember the uncle who confused arrogance with strength. I remember the aunt who stayed silent when she should have spoken. I remember the cousins who laughed because silence made them feel safe. And I remember the faces afterward. The regret, the shame, the awareness that came too late. But above all, I remember my father. Not because he won some dramatic battle. Not because he destroyed anyone. Not because he made a scene. I remember him because he stood still while others exposed themselves. I remember him because he refused to collapse on command. I remember him because he walked away from a system that only loved him when it needed him. And I remember how that walk changed the whole family more than any argument ever could. Years later, when I think about what real strength looks like, I do not think of shouting. I do not think of revenge. I do not think of dominance. I think of a man quietly setting down what he has carried for too long. I think of a man saying without words, I am done proving my worth to people who should have already seen it. That is strength. That is dignity. That is the kind of power no crowd can take away. And maybe that is why this story has stayed with me so deeply. Because it taught me something that I will carry for the rest of my life. Being needed is not the same as being loved. Being useful is not the same as being valued. And being silent is not the same as being weak. My father proved all of that without ever raising his voice. He gave his family everything. They belittled him. He answered with calm. They lost access to him. Then they finally understood who he had been all along, but by then, he had already built a life that did not require their permission. A life with peace, a life with art, a life with boundaries, a life that belonged to him. And that, more than anything, was the real ending. Not that they finally respected him, but that he no longer had to wait for it. He had already chosen himself. And once he did, he never had to shrink again. But even then, one more thing happened that I never expected. It was small, almost invisible. And yet, it told me more about my father than all the earlier moments combined. It happened at a family dinner in the early autumn. Nothing fancy, no big decorations, no guests. Just the usual table, the usual food, and the usual people who had once made the mistake of thinking time would heal what they had never truly apologized for. By then, the atmosphere had changed a lot. Not completely, but enough. People were more careful around my father now. They did not interrupt him as much. They did not speak to him with the same careless confidence. Even the ones who had once mocked him now carried themselves differently when he entered a room. That kind of change does not happen because people become saints. It happens because they have finally learned that silence can have a cost. Still, my father remained the same in the ways that mattered. He was kind. He was calm. He was present, just no longer available for disrespect. During dinner, my younger cousin asked him a question that made the whole table go quiet. "Uncle," she said, "why did you stay so long if they treated you like that?" It was such an innocent question. But the room changed the second she asked it, because everybody knew she was asking something the adults had avoided for months. My father did not look offended. He did not look startled. He simply put down his fork, leaned back in his chair, and thought for a moment. Then he said, "Because I believed that love could teach people better than fear could." No one moved. He continued, "I thought if I kept showing up with patience, they would eventually realize what I was giving. I thought if I stayed calm, they would become gentle. I thought if I kept helping, they would learn gratitude." He looked around the table slowly. "But I was wrong about some of that." The room stayed silent. Then he added, "Love can teach people, but only if they are willing to learn." That sentence sat in the air like a final judgment. Not cruel, just clear. My cousin nodded, as if she understood more than the adults wanted her to. And maybe she did. Children often understand the truth before grown people are ready to name it. After dinner, my father stepped outside onto the back porch with his tea. I followed him. The air was cool. The yard was quiet. The night had that soft, settling feeling that comes when a long day is finally ending. He stood at the railing and looked out into the dark. I asked him, "Do you ever wish you had spoken up sooner?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said, "but then I might have spoken from pain. I wanted to speak from clarity." I let that sit for a second. Then I asked, "Was it hard?" He turned toward me. "Of course, it was hard," he said. "People think silence means nothing is happening, but silence can be the hardest thing a person carries." I nodded. He looked back out at the yard and said, "The hardest part was realizing I had spent so many years being useful that I forgot I could simply be." That hit me deeply, because that was it. That was the whole story in one sentence. Being useful. That can become a prison if you are not careful. A man can spend years being the answer to everyone else's problems until no one remembers he has problems too. My father had lived that way for too long, and now, after all the humiliation, all the disappointment, all the quiet rebuilding, he had become someone who no longer measured his worth by how much he could carry. That was freedom. Not loud freedom, not flashy freedom, the kind that sits quietly on a porch at night and finally breathes without apology. A few days later, something even more surprising happened. My uncle invited my father to meet him alone. No family gathering, no witnesses, just the two of them. When my father told me, I thought he might refuse, but he didn't. He said, "If a man is willing to speak honestly, then I should be willing to listen. That was another thing about him. He never became closed off. He became selective. That is what healing looked like for him. Not shutting the world out, just refusing to let the wrong people in too easily. They went out for coffee in the afternoon. When my father came home, he did not look excited. He did not look angry. He looked tired in the quiet way that comes after a real conversation. I asked him, "How did it go?" He sat down slowly and said, "Better than I expected." Then he said, "He finally understood that I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was just done pretending the pain didn't matter." I watched him carefully, and he admitted something I think he had never said out loud before. "What?" My father folded his hands. He said he was jealous. I stared at him. "Jealous?" My father nodded. He said he resented how people trusted me without me ever demanding the spotlight. He said he thought being quiet made me weak, but really, it made me harder to read, harder to control, harder to dismiss forever. That was a shocking confession, but not an unbelievable one, because jealousy is often what arrogance becomes when it finally has to face humility. My father continued. He said he didn't understand until he nearly lost access to me. I asked, "Did you forgive him?" He thought about it carefully. Then he said, "I do not confuse forgiveness with returning to the old arrangement." That was another line I will never forget, because it was so mature, so clean, so deeply true. Forgiveness does not always mean restoration. Sometimes it simply means you no longer want to carry poison inside your own heart. That evening, after my father went to his room, I stood in the kitchen thinking about everything. About the wedding, about the laughter, about the public humiliation, about the paper he had handed over, about the way the entire room had slowly realized that the man they tried to shame was the one who had been holding them up for years. And now, months later, I saw the larger truth. He had not just changed the family, he had changed the emotional structure of our whole world. He tapped the page gently. That was the old version of me. Then he turned the page over and found a newer sketch. This one was different. He was sitting by the lake, painting, with the sunset behind him. No one else in the frame, just him, and the peace on his face. I smiled a little. He saw me smiling and asked, "What?" I said, "This one looks happier." He nodded. "Yes," he said. "This one belongs to me." Those words were simple, but they were so powerful that I had to look away for a moment. This one belongs to me. That was what he had been fighting for all along. Not revenge, not praise, not control, just ownership of his own life. The right to exist without being consumed. The right to help without being used. The right to love without being erased. And maybe that is why his story stayed with everyone so deeply. Because at some point, almost every person feels the pressure to become useful enough to keep earning a place at the table. But a healthy life should never require you to shrink until you disappear. It should never require you to bleed quietly just to keep the room calm. My father showed me that. He showed me that dignity can be quiet, that strength does not need an audience, that boundaries are not cruelty, and that a person can be broken in public and still become whole in private. As the months passed, the family stopped bringing up the old events as much. Not because they forgot, but because they were no longer comfortable pretending it never happened. And my father never brought it up unless he had to. That was another kind of power. He did not obsess over the wound. He learned from it. He carried the lesson, not the bitterness. That is what made him different from the people who hurt him. They wanted to move on without accountability. He wanted peace with truth. Those are not the same thing. One is escape. The other is healing. One night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I found him sitting alone in the living room, reading under a small lamp. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels safe. I sat across from him and asked, "Are you happy now?" He took a moment before answering. Then he said, "I am honest now. Happiness comes and goes. Honesty stays." I smiled at that, because It sounded exactly like him. Then he looked up from his book and said something I still think about all the time. "Remember this," he said. "People can survive many kinds of pain, but they do not survive being unseen forever." I held that in my heart, because that was the deepest truth of the whole story. He had survived the humiliation. He had survived the betrayal. He had survived the silence. But the real damage had come from the years of being unseen, and the real healing had come when he refused to be unseen anymore. That was the turning point, not when they apologized, not when they needed him again, but when he stepped into his own life and stopped waiting for permission to matter. That was when everything changed. And that is why, even now, I tell this story with so much feeling. Because I know how easy it is for people to take the steady ones for granted. The quiet ones. The helpers. The ones who always show up. The ones who never ask for much. The ones who keep carrying everything until their own lives disappear inside the load. My father was one of those people. And when he finally said enough, the whole family had to face the truth they had avoided for years. He had been the strongest person in the room all along. They just mistook his silence for weakness. They mistook his patience for permission. They mistook his love for endless availability. But love is not endless when it is abused. Patience has a limit, and quiet men can become unforgettable the moment they choose themselves. That was my father. And after everything, I can say this with complete honesty. He did not lose by walking away from being taken for granted. He won his life back, and that is a victory far more powerful than applause, far more lasting than revenge, and far more beautiful than anyone in that room understood at the time, because the man they tried to humiliate became the man they could no longer reach without respect. And once that happened, he was free, finally, truly, completely free. And after that, something unexpected happened. Not dramatic, not loud, just something small that proved how much the family had changed. It was the first winter after everything settled. The days were shorter, the air was colder, and the house had that quiet, wrapped-up feeling that comes when people spend more time indoors and more time thinking. My father had been spending his evenings in the study room, working on a large canvas he refused to show anyone until it was finished. He said very little about it. That was unusual for him only because it showed how much this painting meant to him. Treated as if his life mattered. The man in the painting was not abandoned. He was free. I felt something rise in my chest when I looked at it. Maybe pride, maybe grief, maybe both. I asked, "What does the suitcase mean?" He gave a small smile. "It means I can leave if I need to." That answer was simple, but it carried so much weight. The suitcase was not about running away. It was about choice. It meant he was no longer trapped in a place that only valued him when he stayed useful. He had options now. He had dignity now. He had a life that belonged to him. And the family knew it. A few weeks later, my aunt came to the house unexpectedly. She was holding a small box. When my father opened the door, she looked nervous in a way I had never seen before. "I came to return something," she said. My father glanced at the box. "What is it?" She lowered her eyes. "A little of what you gave us. Not enough. I know that. But I wanted to bring something back." Inside the box were old envelopes, receipts, and a few small pieces of jewelry my mother had once let her borrow during hard times. Nothing huge. Nothing that could undo years of carelessness. But the gesture itself mattered. My father did not rush to accept it. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "Why now?" My aunt took a breath. "Because I finally understand what it feels like to be invisible until someone needs you," she said. That answer surprised me. It was not polished. It was not perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, after years of denial, can sound almost tender. My father stepped aside and let her in. He offered tea. She sat at the table quietly, looking older than she used to. After a while, she said, "I used to think you were lucky, because you never complained." My father sat across from her and replied, "I was not lucky. I was patient." She nodded. Then he said, And patience is not the same thing as permission. That line again, it kept returning because it was the key to everything. My aunt looked at him and said, "We made it easy to misuse you." He did not deny it. He said, "Yes, and I made it easy for too long." That was another truth. A hard one, because healing is never only about what others did to us. Sometimes it is also about how long we stayed silent while it happened. Not because we deserved it, but because we hoped it would change. That afternoon, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness in the dramatic sense, not some perfect emotional release, just a deeper honesty. And that honesty had a kind of peace inside it. The kind of peace that does not come from pretending. It comes from knowing the full truth and not hiding from it anymore. When my aunt left, she hugged my mother before she walked out the door. No one said much, but the air felt different after she went. Not healed, not fixed, but more human. Later that evening, my father took the box and placed it inside a drawer in the study. I asked him, "Are you going to keep it?" He nodded. "Why?" He thought for a second. "Because I do not want to erase the past," he said. "I want to remember it correctly." That was the wisdom he had earned. Not denial, not revenge. Memory with clarity. That is a rare thing. Most people either pretend nothing happened, or they let the pain define everything forever. But my father chose a third way. He remembered, and he moved forward. Weeks turned into months. The family slowly learned how to treat him without expectation. They called less for favors and more for conversation. They visited without asking for things. They started asking how his paintings were going. They listened when he spoke. And sometimes, when they forgot themselves for a moment, he reminded them gently, not harshly, just enough. Because he had learned that a boundary does not need to shout to be real. One spring morning, we all went to the lake. It was the first time the whole family had gone together since the wedding disaster and everything that followed. There were no speeches, no special announcements, just sandwiches, folding chairs, and the soft sound of water moving against the shore. My father sat a little apart from the rest of the group with his sketchbook in his lap. A cousin came over and asked, "Can I sit here?" He smiled and said, "Of course." That small moment meant more than people could understand. There was a time when he would have been expected to make room for everyone else automatically. Now, they asked, that difference mattered. The cousin sat beside him and watched him paint for a while. Then she said, "I used to think quiet people were easy to ignore." My father kept painting as she spoke. She continued, "Now, I think quiet people just notice more than we do." He looked at her and nodded once. "That is usually true," he said. She asked, "Did you notice everything?" He gave a soft laugh. Enough to know when love becomes habit. That was the end of her questions, and maybe the beginning of her understanding. The family stayed at the lake until sunset. At one point, my grandfather, who had become noticeably more thoughtful since all of this, asked my father to take a photo with him. They stood together by the water. My grandfather placed a hand on his shoulder. No one said much, but I could see it. Respect, real respect. Not loud, not performative. The kind that comes after a lesson has finally been learned. After the photo, my grandfather looked at him and said, "I was slow to see what you carried." My father answered, "Most people were." My grandfather nodded, accepting the truth without offense. That, too, was a kind of healing. Not erasing the wound, just refusing to lie about it. On the ride home, I asked my father if he was happy. He kept his eyes on the road for a moment before answering. "I think happiness is too small a word for it now," he said. I smiled. "Then what is it?" He thought about it. Then he said, "Peace, the kind that does not depend on anyone else's mood." That stayed with me, because that is what he had earned. Not applause, not revenge. Peace. The kind that belongs to a person who has finally stopped betraying himself to keep everyone else comfortable. When we got home, he went straight to his study and placed a fresh canvas on the easel. I asked, "What are you painting now?" He looked up at me and said, A door. A door? He nodded. An open one. I stood there for a moment, understanding. Not a closed door to the family, not a locked door to the past. An open door. A life with options. A heart with boundaries. A man with enough self-respect to leave if he has to, and enough love to stay only where he is honored. That painting became one of my favorites, because it was not just about a door, it was about a life. And that was the final meaning of the story. Not that my father became hard, not that he became distant, not that he stopped loving his family. He simply learned that love should never require self-erasure. He learned that being respected is not a luxury. It is the foundation. He learned that the people who once laughed at his silence were never the ones qualified to define his worth. And he learned that the moment he stopped being easily accessible, he became impossible to overlook. That was the real turning point. The family later realized his importance. But the truth is, he had been important all along. They were just late to the truth, late to gratitude, late to humility, late to understanding the quiet man who had spent years carrying more than anyone knew. And by the time they finally understood, he had already found something better than their approval. He had found himself. So when I think about him now, I do not think of the humiliation first. I think of the chair by the porch, the sketchbook by the water, the calm in his voice when he said no, the strength in his silence when others expected him to break, and the open door he painted at the end. Because that door was not only for him, it was for every person who has ever given too much, stayed too long, and forgotten that they were allowed to choose themselves too. That is the story. That is the lesson. And that is why, even after everything, I will always remember him not as the man they tried to shame, but as the man who quietly walked out of their shadow and into his own life. Unbroken, unapologetic, and finally free. And after that, the story did not end with a dramatic scene. It ended the way real life often does, quietly, slowly, with small moments that prove whether change is real. The open door my father painted stayed in his study for a long time. Every time I walked past it, I noticed something new in it. Sometimes the light looked warmer, sometimes the shadow around the frame looked softer. But the meaning never changed. It was a painting about choice, about not being trapped anymore, about a man who had spent too many years standing inside other people's expectations and finally stepped into a life that was his own. By then, the family had become different enough that even the air in the house felt less tense. Not perfect, not magical, just healthier. People still made mistakes. People still slipped into old habits. But now, when they did, there was a pause, a correction, a reminder. And my father no longer carried the whole burden of teaching everyone how to behave. That alone changed everything. I remember one evening when my youngest cousin came over with a school project. She was supposed to interview someone in the family about strength. She chose my father. Of course she did. She sat across from him at the table, notebook open, pencil ready, and asked, "Uncle, what is strength?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. Then he said, "Strength is not making people fear you. Strength is not being loud. Strength is not pretending nothing hurts." She nodded quickly, writing it down. He continued, "Strength is staying honest when it would be easier to lie. It is walking away when staying would destroy you. It is knowing you are allowed to matter even when other people are used to you disappearing." The little girl looked up at him and asked, "Did you disappear?" The whole room went quiet. My father smiled, but there was sadness in it too. "Sometimes," he said. "For too long." She frowned, not fully understanding, but understanding enough to be serious. Then she asked the question that made my throat tighten. "Did they ever say sorry?" My father's hands folded together on the table. "Yes," he said. "And was it enough?" He thought about that. Then he answered, "It was enough to begin, not enough to erase what happened." That was the kind of answer that made him who he was. No pretending, no exaggeration, no performance, just truth, carefully spoken. The child nodded and wrote it down like it mattered. And it did, Because that is how lessons pass from one generation to another, not through lectures, through lived truth. Later that week, something happened that none of us expected. My father received an invitation to speak at a small community gathering. It was not a big stage, not a famous event, just a local group that had heard about his work, his calm leadership, and the way he had handled family conflict with dignity. He almost declined. I remember him holding the invitation in his hand and staring at it like it belonged to someone else. I asked, "Why wouldn't you go?" He said, "Because I don't need attention." I looked at him and smiled. "I know, but maybe they need to hear you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the words that stayed with me for the rest of my life. I spent too many years being heard only when I was useful. If I speak now, I want it to mean something. So he went. And when he came back that evening, I could see that the room had done something to him. Not in a bad way, in a healing way. He looked more certain, not bigger, not louder, just more himself. I asked, "How was it?" He loosened his coat and sat down slowly. Then he said, "They listened." That was all, just those two words. But in his voice, I could hear how much that meant. To be listened to without being interrupted. To be valued without being needed. To be seen without having to collapse first. That mattered to him, maybe more than he admitted. A few weeks after that, my uncle came over again. This time he stayed longer. This time he did not try to control the conversation. This time he asked my father about the painting by the lake. He asked about the colors. He asked about the chair on the porch. He even asked about the old sketchbook. And my father answered him with the calm distance of a man who had forgiven enough to stop carrying hatred, but not enough to mistake that for forgetting. That was another lesson. You can be civil without being naive. You can be kind without being open to harm. You can forgive without returning to the same door that once led you into pain. My uncle seemed to understand that now. One afternoon, I saw him standing in the doorway watching my father work in the yard. My father was repairing a broken fence panel. Nothing dramatic, just simple work with steady hand. My uncle said quietly, almost to himself, "He used to do everything." I heard him. He heard himself too. And for a second, I think he finally felt the weight of that sentence. He used to do everything. That was the truth the family had spent years avoiding. They had not just been helped, they had been carried. And when a person carries a family long enough, the family can start to think the carrying is natural. Normal. Permanent. But nothing like that is permanent, especially not when love turns into expectation. That evening, my father finished the fence and came inside. My uncle thanked him, not with grand words, just a simple, honest thank you. It was late, but it was real. My father nodded once and said, "You're welcome." Then he walked past him toward the kitchen. No bitterness, no triumph. Just a man who knew his worth and no longer needed to prove it in every room. That, more than anything, was the change. The family no longer saw a shadow. They saw a boundary. They saw a person who could still be warm, still be loving, still be helpful, but never again at the cost of himself. And because of that, even the smallest interactions felt different, softer, more respectful, more human. One night, near the end of the year, we all sat outside around a small fire. The air was cold, but the fire kept us warm. Nobody was trying too hard. No one was performing. My father sat in his usual chair, wrapped in a jacket, looking into the flames with the kind of calm that only comes after a long storm has passed. I looked around at the faces in the circle and realized something. No one was laughing at him anymore. No one was trying to test him. No one was making jokes at his expense. They had learned, slowly, painfully, what they had learned, and maybe that was the closest thing to justice this story ever got. Not revenge, not humiliation returned, just a family forced to grow up. My grandfather broke the silence first. He cleared his throat and said, "I should have spoken sooner." My father looked at him calmly. I know, he said. That answer was not cruel. It was honest enough to stand on its own. My grandfather nodded. Then he said, Still, I'm sorry. The fire crackled between us. My father looked at him for a moment, then gave a slight nod. I accept that, he said, not as a surrender, not as a performance, as a choice. And in that moment, I felt something inside the family settle. Not perfectly, but enough. Because sometimes the thing that heals a wound is not a dramatic apology or a giant speech. Sometimes it is one person finally telling the truth, and another person finally deciding not to make the truth heavier than it already is. After everyone went inside, I stayed out by the fire with my father. The night was quiet. The stars were sharp. The world felt wide in that strange, peaceful way it does when a chapter is truly ending. I asked him, Do you think they really understand now? He watched the last bits of fire turn red. Then he said, Some do. Some only understand enough to behave better. That may not be perfect, but it is still different from before. I nodded. Then I asked, And you? He looked up at the sky. And me, he said. I understand that I do not have to disappear to deserve love. That was the sentence that ended everything inside me, because that was the whole heart of the story. He had spent years living like love had to be earned through sacrifice, like belonging required silence, like being a good son. Brother, husband, or father meant accepting disrespect if it came from family. But he learned the truth. Love that requires self-erasure is not love at all, and respect that arrives only after humiliation is not enough to undo the damage, even if it arrives sincerely. What mattered was that he had stopped waiting for either one to save him. He saved himself, not with anger, not with revenge, with boundaries, with honesty, with a life that no longer revolved around being convenient for everyone else. That was why the family later realized his importance, because he became less accessible. Yes. But more importantly, he became more whole. And once a person becomes whole, people cannot use them the same way anymore. The final thing I remember happened on an ordinary morning. My father was at the table with his tea, his sketchbook, and the sunlight falling across the floor. He looked peaceful, really peaceful. Not the kind of peace that comes from the world being fixed. The kind that comes from no longer betraying yourself to keep the peace around you. I stood there for a moment watching him, and he looked up and smiled at me. What is it? I shook my head, smiling too. Nothing, I said. I just think they finally see you. He gave a soft, almost tired laugh. Maybe, he said. But I see me now too. And that was the end of the story. Not because the family became perfect, not because the past disappeared, not because every wound was erased. It ended because the man who had once sacrificed everything for everyone else finally chose a life where he did not have to vanish to be loved. He was respected now, but more than that, he was free. And for a man like him, after all that silence, freedom was the greatest respect of all. And just when I thought the story had already given me its final lesson, life found one more way to surprise me. It was late that year, almost winter again. The house felt quieter than usual. Not sad, just still. The kind of stillness that comes when a family has finally lived through enough pain to stop making noise for no reason. My father had become even calmer by then. Not withdrawn, not cold, just settled. He moved through the house like a man who had made peace with himself. He still helped when he wanted to. He still showed kindness when it was deserved. But the desperate need to prove himself was gone. That was the biggest change of all. One evening, I found him in the study, standing in front of the old painting of the open door. He was not painting anymore. He was just looking at it. I asked him, "What are you thinking about?" He smiled faintly and said, How strange it is that people only understand your value after you stop standing where they expect. I leaned against the doorframe and listened. He continued. For years, I thought being dependable meant staying no matter what. I thought if I stayed long enough, people would learn gratitude. But I learned something else instead. I waited. He turned toward me and said, people do not always grow because you give more. Sometimes they grow because you finally give less. That stayed with me because it was true. Not just in our family, in life. Some people only respect what they cannot endlessly consume. Some only notice the hand that fed them when that hand is no longer there. And some only learn the value of peace after they have lost access to the person who created it. A few days later, my cousin asked to see the old wedding hall photos. She was curious. We were all surprised. But my father said yes. We sat together and looked through the pictures one by one. There it was. The lights, the flowers, the smiles that looked real to everyone except the people inside them. Then came the picture that mattered most. My father standing near the edge of the room, quiet and composed, while the rest of the family laughed in the background. The image hit harder now than it had then, because now we understood what we were seeing. Not a man who didn't matter. A man who mattered so much that everyone forgot to protect him. My cousin looked at the photo and whispered, "He looks alone." Nobody answered for a moment. Then my father said, "I was." His voice was not bitter. That was what made it stronger. He was simply stating what had been true. And sometimes truth, when spoken without anger, becomes impossible to dismiss. Then he added, "But being alone is not always the same as being abandoned." I looked at him. He explained, "Sometimes being alone is the moment you finally hear yourself clearly." That was the wisdom he had earned through everything. The house had changed enough that people now came to him differently. Not because they were perfect, not because they suddenly became saints, but because they had seen what happened when they crossed the line and lost access to the person who had always made their lives easier. That kind of lesson leaves a mark, even on proud people, even on stubborn people, especially on them. One afternoon, my uncle came by with his head lower than usual. He asked my father if they could talk on the porch. I watched from the window as they sat outside in the cold air. Two men with years of silence between them. When my father came back in, I asked, "What did he say?" My father took off his coat slowly before answering. He asked if there was anything left to fix. I stayed quiet. He sat down and continued. I told him yes, but not everything broken can be restored to what it was. Then he looked at me and said, "Sometimes repair means accepting a new shape." That was such a heavy sentence, because it was true of people, too. Some relationships can be mended, but not returned. Some trust can be rebuilt, but not relived. Some respect can be earned again, but not on the same terms. The old version of our family could never come back. Too much had happened. Too much had been learned. Too much had changed. And maybe that was for the best, because if nothing had changed, then nothing would have been truly healed. That winter, my father started volunteering at a small community center. Not because he needed to be useful again, but because he wanted to share what he had learned. He helped young fathers, quiet sons, and older men who were carrying too much without saying it out loud. He never made it about himself. He just talked about boundaries, about self-respect, about how love should never require a person to disappear. People listened, not because he was loud, because he was real. And I think that was the final stage of his journey. He had gone from being unseen, to being undervalued, to being respected, to finally becoming a voice for others like him. That was the kind of full circle ending life rarely gives people, but he earned it, every part of it. One night, after one of those meetings, he came home later than usual. He looked tired, but in the good way, the peaceful way. I asked, "Did it help?" He nodded. "More than I expected," he said. "I think there are many people who are tired of being everything for everyone," I said. You know that's your story too, right? He smiled. Yes, he said. And I think that is why they listened. There it was again. The quiet power of someone who had lived the pain instead of just talking about it. He did not offer advice from above. He offered it from inside the wound. That is why it mattered. Months passed. The family continued to grow, slowly, unevenly, humanly. There were still awkward moments, still regrets, still old habits trying to return and getting pushed back down. But the difference now was that my father no longer collapsed to keep the peace. He let people sit with discomfort. He let truth stay visible. He let the consequences of their actions teach what he had once tried to teach with endless sacrifice. And because of that, the family changed in a real way. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to show that respect, once broken, can return only if the people involved are willing to become different. One evening, my grandfather said something I will always remember. We were all at the table, eating quietly, when he looked at my father and said, "You became a better man after they hurt you." My father looked up, surprised, but my grandfather raised one finger and added, "Not because they hurt you, because you refused to let the hurt decide who you were." That was the kind of sentence that makes a whole room go still. My father lowered his eyes, not from shame, but from feeling. And I understood then that this was the true ending of the story. Not the humiliation, not the apology, not the family's regret. The ending was the choice he made after all of it. He chose not to become bitter. He chose not to become cruel. He chose not to keep disappearing for the comfort of people who had grown used to taking his presence for granted. He chose himself, and that choice changed everything around him. That is the part I will always carry with me. Because the strongest person in our family was never the loudest one. It was the one who gave quietly, loved deeply, suffered silently, and then stood up when the world expected him to stay small. He did not need a crowd to validate him. He did not need applause to be real. He only needed one thing at the end of all that sacrifice: a life that was finally his own, and he took it. That is why, when I think of him now, I do not think of the night he was humiliated. I think of the mornings after, the tea on the porch, the sketchbook in his hand, the calm in his voice, the open door in the painting, the man standing at the threshold, no longer waiting. That was my father, and that was the real victory. Not that the family realized his importance, though they did. Not that they apologized, though some tried. Not that they respected him, though many finally did. The real victory was that he no longer needed any of it to know who he was. He had already become whole, and once a person becomes whole, they are never truly at the mercy of being unseen again. That is where the story ends. Not with revenge, not with regret, with freedom. Quiet, steady, unshakable freedom. Here's the next continuation. And just when it seemed like the whole family had finally reached the end of its lesson, life brought one last moment that none of us saw coming. It happened on an early spring morning. The air was soft, the sky was pale, and the whole house had that quiet feeling that comes after a long winter begins to loosen its grip. My father had already been awake for hours. He always was. He was in the kitchen making tea, then in the study looking at old papers, then outside checking the plants near the fence. He moved slowly now, but with purpose. He no longer rushed to solve everything for everyone. He simply lived. That morning, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a phone call, a real letter in a plain white envelope. My father looked at it for a moment before opening it. He stood by the window while he read, and I could tell by the way his face changed that it was important. When he finished, he folded the page and sat down very carefully. I asked, "What is it?" He looked at me and said, "It's from your uncle's son." That surprised me. My cousin had never been close to him. He had grown up watching the old family pattern. but he had mostly kept his distance from the drama. My father handed me the letter. I read it slowly. It was simple, but honest. He wrote that he had spent years hearing stories about the wedding, about the humiliation, about the way my father had quietly walked away from the life that had taken him for granted. He said he used to think it was just one family fight, one bad night, one emotional accident. But then he grew older, and then he started working, and then he began carrying the kind of pressure my father had carried for years. That was when he understood. He wrote, I used to think strength meant never slowing down, but now I see strength in the people who carry everyone else and still remain kind. At the bottom of the page, he wrote one more line. I'm sorry I didn't understand sooner. I looked up from the letter and saw my father staring out the window. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't crying. He was simply still. And sometimes stillness is the deepest kind of feeling. After a while, he said, It is strange. I asked, What is? He said, The people who hurt you rarely understand your pain when they are causing it, but the next generation sometimes sees what the last one refused to see. That stayed with me because it was true. Children notice what adults excuse. Younger people understand what older pride tried to hide. And sometimes the clearest apology comes from someone who was never directly involved, but who was wise enough to learn the lesson anyway. A few days after that, my father decided to go back to the old wedding hall. Not to relive the pain, not to prove anything, just to speak at a small event the hall was hosting for local families. It was a community gathering about financial planning and family responsibility. The organizers had asked him to speak because of his reputation for calm leadership and practical wisdom. At first, he almost declined. He told me, I don't need to go back there. But then he paused and said, Maybe I do. Not for them, for me. So he went. I sat in the audience while he stood on that same stage where, years earlier, the room had celebrated other people's pride and ignored his worth. This time, the hall was different. The crowd was smaller. The lights were simpler. The atmosphere was quieter. But the power of the moment was not smaller. Not at all. My father walked to the microphone with his usual calm. No grand entrance. No performance. Just a man who had been through fire and come back without smoke on his face. He looked at the crowd and said, A family can survive many things. Hard times, money problems, misunderstandings, even pride. But there is one thing families do not survive easily. He paused, taking one person for granted for too long. The room went silent. He continued, People think the strongest member of the family is the one who speaks the loudest, earns the most, or makes the biggest show of control. But often, the strongest one is the person quietly covering the gaps everyone else refuses to see. I could feel the audience leaning in. He looked down at his notes, then back up. For years, I believed that if I kept giving, people would eventually understand. But giving without respect becomes a lesson in what people can get away with. If you want a family to stay healthy, gratitude has to be a habit, not an afterthought. No one moved. No one checked their phones. They listened, really listened. And I realized something in that moment. My father was not just speaking about our story anymore. He was speaking for every person who had ever sat at a family table feeling invisible. Every quiet son, every older brother, every father, every mother, every person whose love had been mistaken for obligation. When he finished, the room stayed still for a second before applause finally came. But it was not the kind of applause people give to be polite. It was slower, deeper, more thoughtful. The kind of applause that says, We heard you. After the event, people came up to him one by one. Some were strangers. Some were local fathers. Some were younger men with tired faces who looked like they had just heard a truth they had needed for years. One man shook my father's hand and said, You just described my life. My father nodded and replied, Then Maybe it's time to stop calling pain normal. That line spread through the room like a quiet shock. Later that day, my uncle asked to speak with him alone again. This time, the two of them walked outside, behind the hall, where the air was cooler and the noise was gone. I watched from a distance as they stood near the side wall, talking for nearly half an hour. When they came back inside, my uncle looked different, not fixed, not healed completely, but changed. There was less arrogance in him now, less pride, less of the old sharpness. He walked up to my father and said, in front of everyone, "I know I will never undo what I did, but I want to say this clearly. You were the backbone of this family long before any of us understood what that meant." The room went silent. My father did not look surprised. He simply nodded once. My uncle swallowed hard and added, "I was wrong to laugh at you. I was wrong to think silence meant weakness. I was wrong to take your kindness for something I was entitled to." That was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. Then he looked at my father and finished, "Thank you for not becoming cruel when we did not deserve your kindness." That line nearly broke me, because that was the heart of everything. My father had every reason to turn bitter. He had every reason to become cold. He had every reason to punish the whole family forever. But he didn't. He stepped back. He set boundaries. He kept his dignity. And in doing so, he became someone the family could finally respect without fear. That is rare. That is powerful. That is unforgettable. As the weeks passed, the story of my father began to move beyond our family. Not because he wanted attention. He didn't. But because people who had known him only as a quiet man started seeing him differently. Neighbors spoke with more respect. Old friends reached out. Younger men in the community began asking him for advice. And my father answered them all with the same calm, measured honesty he had always had. He never acted like a hero. He never acted like a victim. He acted like a man who had learned the difference between sacrifice and self-erasure. That difference changed me too. I stopped seeing kindness as something that required me to disappear. I stopped thinking that love meant saying yes to everything. I stopped believing that the loudest person in a room was always the strongest. My father taught me something far more valuable. He taught me that strength can be quiet, that dignity can be peaceful, that walking away from disrespect is not selfish, and that being respected often begins the moment you stop accepting what hurts you just to keep the peace. Years later, when I look back on the wedding, I no longer remember only the humiliation. I remember what came after. The silence, the boundaries, the way my father rebuilt his life one calm decision at a time. I remember the porch at sunset, the sketchbook, the lake, the open door in the painting. I remember the way he sat at the kitchen table reading letters from people who finally understood too late. And I remember the best part of all. He never begged them to understand. He simply became impossible to ignore. That was his victory, not revenge, not applause, not even apology. Freedom. The freedom to live without shrinking, the freedom to give without being drained, the freedom to love without being used, the freedom to finally belong to himself. That was the lesson our family learned. Some learned it late. Some learned it slowly. Some learned it with embarrassment. But in the end, the truth found its way in. The man they underestimated was never small. He was just tired of proving his size to people who should have already known. And once he stopped making himself available to disrespect, the whole family had no choice but to see him clearly. Not as the quiet one, not as the convenient one, but as the one who had carried more than anyone else ever noticed. That is why, when people ask me what happened after the humiliation, I tell them this: he didn't break, he didn't beg, he didn't lose. He rose quietly, and that quiet rise changed everything. Forever. I can keep going with one more powerful closing section, or I can now turn the whole story into a clean final YouTube script with smoother pacing and stronger emotional hooks. Here's the next continuation. And there was still one final thing that made the whole story feel complete. It happened on a normal evening, the kind that looks too ordinary to remember while it is happening. The sky was dim. The house was quiet. My father was sitting by the window with his tea, and I was across the room sorting a pile of old family photos. I had not planned to look at them for long, but one picture caught my eye. It was from years ago, before the wedding, before the humiliation, before the boundaries, before the family learned what they had lost. My father was standing in the background of the photo, half turned away from the camera, carrying a tray of drinks, while everyone else smiled in the foreground. He was there, but not included. Present, but overlooked. Useful, but never centered. I held the photo up and looked at him. "Do you remember this?" He glanced over, saw the picture, and nodded slowly. "Yes," I asked. "Did it ever bother you?" He took a long sip of tea before answering. "Not at first," he said. "I was too busy trying to be helpful. Then one day I realized I had spent so long making sure everyone else had a place that I never checked whether I had one too." That sentence stayed in the room after he said it, because that was the real wound all along. Not the public insult, not the cruel joke, not the family drama. It was the slow, silent erasing of a man who had given everything and asked for almost nothing back. I set the photo down and asked, "Do you still feel angry?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "Anger was useful at first. It told me something was wrong, but I do not live there anymore." Then he looked at me and added, "I live in the place where I know my worth, even if other people are slow to catch up." That was the clearest thing he had ever said, and maybe the strongest, because there is a kind of peace that only comes after a person stops trying to convince the world to treat them better and starts treating themselves as someone worth protecting. My father had reached that place, not by becoming hard, not by becoming cold, not by becoming distant for the sake of pride. He simply stopped offering unlimited access to people who could not handle it with care. That was the turning point. The family never returned to the old version of itself. It couldn't. Too much truth had entered the room. Too many habits had been exposed. Too many people had seen the cost of taking a quiet man for granted. And because of that, the whole house began to live differently. People thanked him more. They asked before assuming. They listened more than they spoke. They watched their word. It was not perfect, but it was better, and better mattered. One evening, my younger cousin came into the room carrying a notebook. She said she had to write an essay about someone who changed the people around them without trying to become famous. She looked straight at my father and said, "I think that's you." He smiled, but he looked humble, almost shy. "I'm not famous," he said. She shook her head. "That's not what I mean." Then she opened her notebook and read the first line she had written. "My uncle taught me that the quietest person in the room can still be the strongest one." My father looked down for a moment, and I saw something in his face that I will never forget. Not pride, not victory, just the deep, tired kind of gratitude. The kind that comes when the truth finally reaches the people you love. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found him on the porch. He was sitting in the old chair he had fixed months earlier, looking up at the sky. The moon was bright. The air was cold. The house behind him looked warm and still. I asked, "What are you thinking about?" He took a moment, then said, "How strange it is that losing access can sometimes teach people more than staying ever could." I sat beside him and waited. He continued, "I did not want to become less available just to prove a point. I became less available because I finally understood that my life was not meant to be spent waiting for respect to arrive." I nodded. He looked out into the dark yard and said, "The family had to learn that love is not the same as convenience." That was the deepest lesson of the whole story. Love is not convenience. Kindness is not permission. Silence is not weakness, and sacrifice is not the same as self-destruction. My father had lived through all of that, and out of it, he built something better. Not a perfect family, not a perfect ending, but a truthful one. A life where he could sit in silence without being invisible. A life where he could help without being used. A life where he could love without disappearing. And maybe that is the best ending any person can hope for. Not applause, not revenge, not even full understanding. Just a place where the soul can breathe without apology. Before we went inside, he stood up from the chair and looked back at the house one more time. Then he said, almost to himself, I used to think I was holding the family together. I waited. He smiled faintly and finished, now I know I was also holding myself back. That line stayed with me long after the night ended, because it was true. He had been so busy being everything for everyone else that he nearly forgot he was allowed to live for himself too. But he remembered, and once he did, everything changed. The family later realized his importance. But the real gift was not that they finally saw him. It was that he finally saw himself. Clearly, fully, without shame, and because of that, he never went back to the old way of living. He still loved them. He still helped where he chose to help. He still stayed kind. But he no longer gave people the power to treat his kindness like a resource they were entitled to. That was the ending. A man who gave everything, a family who learned too late, and a quiet victory that was never meant to be loud. He did not need to shout to matter. He did not need to break to be seen. He did not need revenge to prove his worth. He only needed to stop disappearing. And once he did, the whole family had no choice but to finally meet him as he truly was. A man with dignity, a man with limits, a man whose silence had never meant weakness at all. It had only meant that he was strong for far too long. And then, at last, he chose himself.